Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Community Collaborative Conversation session. It's the fourth in a series of meetings that a number of citizens and various public groups have started in order to extend the conversation about different ways we can be adjusting for and preventing the climate problem, different actions we can take, and both providing information to community members and collecting their thoughts and ideas on ways we can all move forward to make a better future. This is, as I mentioned, our fourth meeting. Tonight we'll be hearing about some pretty interesting topics about land use issues in our Belle Haven neighborhood. But at this point, I'd like to just turn it over to, I believe it's Juanita for our land acknowledgement.
Need to unmute her.
We can hear you, Pam.
But Juanita, there you go.
Okay. I acknowledge that we are in the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of the land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. We are guests and recognize we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland.
Right. Thank you so much, Juanita.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd also now like to introduce this evening's speakers. Juanita Croft is an advisory board chair of the Belle Haven Community Development Fund. She'll be joined by Pam Jones, founder of Belle Haven Empowered. Together, they'll be giving our first presentation. Then we'll have a question and answer period for them. They'll be focusing on various aspects of the history of the Belle Haven neighborhood and how it relates in Menlo Park. And then they'll be followed by a presentation by Cade Kennedy, community organizer and program manager with Climate Resilient Communities. Cade will be sharing information and asking for, or sharing information and conversation about the the general plan update, the housing element update, and how it relates to this area as well. We'll follow both of those sessions, each one of them, with a question and answer session. And so if you can write your questions in the chat, we can read them to the speakers and get those answers for you, as well as keep a nice record of the questions. And then following the second Q&A, we will have just an open community conversation about the things raised and areas that people would like to discuss. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Juanita and Pam.
Thank you.
Thank you. So here's our agenda for today. We'll first look at the color of law Belle Haven, a neighborhood in Menlo Park. It will include discriminatory practices used, the legacy of discriminatory practices, and there's the second part, which will be the housing element update. And we've already been given that information. The map that you see on the side here is an EnviroScreen map that was used by Kate Bradshaw in a series of articles that she did. So this slide is when Menlo Park was first incorporated in 1874, and you had to be incorporated at that time in order, I think it was to do road work. And so when that was done, Menlo Park initiated it, and you can see from the red line, the red outline, that it included East Palo Alto, Belle Haven, actually all the area to the water, and then the area that we now know as the Willows, Atherton, as well as North Fair Oaks. So the significance of that area is that in 1935, Belle Haven City existed. It was just unincorporated. And the area that you see here to Willow Road, to Pacific Railroad, and then it actually extended here. It shows to Bay Road, but other documents have shown us that it actually Belle Haven City extended to Middlefield. Juanita.
Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about, as we go through the rest of the presentation, about the different discriminatory practices used from the 1950s when African Americans were encouraged to come to Belle Haven through today. And so some of the terminology that we're going to talk about is the redlining, blockbusting, how single family zoning affects it, segregation, having physical boundaries that define our red lines, the effect of divestment of the segregated neighborhood and the school district, specifically the Ravenswood City School District, the impact of subprime loans, gentrification, and busing. So here's an example of redlining in 1934. And this practice was created by the federal government under the Federal Housing Authority. And so they chose to refuse to insure homes for Black families and even white families if their property was too close to where Black people live. So here is an example of a map that shows redlining in San Jose, and you can see the areas as they are blocked out. So those areas would not have been insured, or Black families could buy in those regions specifically. This shows you the natural boundaries for Belle Haven and East Palo Alto. And so we didn't have to have a map, or we haven't found a map yet that specifically shows it, but the freeway was coming in as the families were moving in. And so this defines our particular triangle that represents Belle Haven and East Palo Alto. Pam, you want to?
Sure. So in the 1950s, what occurred was that the realtors did a practice that was called blockbusting. The African-American population that was in San Francisco, particularly, as well as in Richmond and the East Bay, began to have jobs down in this area. And so they needed to live somewhere here. And it was decided that it would be East Palo Alto and Belle Haven. And what they did is they literally brought busloads of Black people from San Francisco and drove up and down the streets. And of course, white people scared them to death. They sold their houses at a fraction of what it was really worth. And then of course, the realtors turned around and sold to African Americans because we could get a loan there, we could live there. And of course, that price was inflated. In 1955, it was clearly documented that that was the practice. And there we will show you some articles in the mid 50s that, again, document what the practice was. So here are some articles from 1955. So there was a charge of the unethical realty practice in Menlo Park, and it was looked at by the Civil Rights Commission. Of course, the president of the then California Real Estate Association, who just happened to be Floyd Lowe, said, of course, no, that's not happening here. If it was, we would report it. But then you also had your realtors that were defending that practice. So by their own admission, it was occurring. And you can see here, while Floyd Lowe is saying on the one hand, this practice isn't really happening, and he couldn't do anything about it. Here's an ad for 50 homes in Belle Haven and the Palo Alto Gardens. And the Palo Alto Gardens is in East Palo Alto, and we still refer to that area as the Gardens, actually shortened, which is where I grew up. So here's the freeway, and interestingly enough, the freeway was widened in 1958. The federal government was giving substantial loans to cities and to states and cities to build the highway system, to build up the highway system. Often these highways went directly through African-American communities, which is what 101 did. It separated what we then called Whiskey Gulch from the rest of the area. But what is significant for me is I remember crossing 101 just like you would now cross El Camino Real. There were lights, and you pushed the button, you waited for the light, and then you crossed.
Okay, here we're showing how the annexation of neighborhoods affected the segregation of the schools. And so there were 4 predominantly white neighborhoods annexed to Menlo Park City School District between 1973 and into 1983. And that created a situation where the Ravenswood City School District then was primarily located within Belle Haven and East Palo Alto. And so there was a challenge to it when the Willows came in because of the way the map was drawn, and it was challenged a bit, but they still ended up being annexed by the Menlo Park City School District. This impacted the tax base for the Ravenswood City School District, having these particular communities leave the school district. And on the, I'm sorry, I was going to go back. On the map that you're looking at, you see the areas that were had been a part of the Ravenswood City School District. And so 1 and 6 were affected by the annexation. And as you can see, that left 2, 3, 4, and 5, Belle Haven and East Palo Alto. Thank you. Now, in 1981, the city became a redevelopment agency. We refer to it as RDA. And that funding was, quote unquote, made available to help communities that were blighted and needed some investment. And so the RDA agency was created in the state of California, and many communities like Belle Haven were able to, the cities were able to apply for that particular funding. As you can see, it covered more than just Belle Haven. It also includes the Willow Road on the other side of the freeway as well. The money was diverted from the school districts and things that other services that our taxes normally would go to fund these particular types of projects. It did end in 2011, and at that point, the city was trying to figure out how they were going to basically find sources of funding for other things that would be done in Belle Haven specifically.
So I want to go back to this slide, Juanita, if you don't
Sure.
mind. Now remember that 2011 is when Facebook formally announced that they were coming in here in February of 2011. And the area where their main campus is and where they want to put the Willow Village was in the RDA. And we're not sure what impact that really had or what it means. And that's another story. The other piece is this is the Flood Park that's owned by the county. So Flood School is back here. So the Flood School site was also in the RDA. So again, we're not really sure what impact that may have.
Okay, the use of zoning as a discriminatory practice, as we can see with the school districts and some of the impact that affected Belle Haven. So we had the annexations, which we've mentioned, that were part of the Ravenswood City School District originally, and then moved over to the Menlo Park School District. We had the Sequoia Union High School District build Ravenswood High School, even though they knew at the time and had been told that they were going to be creating a segregated high school. And this occurred after Brown versus the Board of Education, which basically declared discrimination in schooling illegal. And so, so after the school went in 58, by 1962, 63, they realized that they couldn't stop the school from becoming segregated because of the neighborhoods that they had created through redlining. And so the population of Ravenswood High School became predominantly Black. And so in an effort to quote unquote integrate the school, they in 62, 63, they allowed white families from the other schools to come and take a look at Ravenswood High School and consider integrating Ravenswood. That was their first attempt. And so they came, and the next year there was a large contingent of families who came to Ravenswood. But before the school year ended, they already knew that it couldn't be integrated, that no other families were willing to come to Ravenswood. And so they immediately made changes to the boundaries in Belle Haven to move some of the Black kids from Belle Haven over to Menlo Atherton. And so the boundary went down the middle of Carlton in 64, 65. And my family was affected by that because my sisters ended up being moved over to Menlo Atherton their last couple of years of school. They tried to continue the school past 1971, which had been another deadline. But once they realized that they could not integrate the school well enough to meet the mandates, they decided to close Ravenswood High School altogether and then bus all of the EPA kids to the other schools in the district, such as Carlmont and Woodside specifically. And they did that busing for 37 years. And it created an extraordinary challenge for our youth in terms of being able to attend a high school and do the normal things you do in high school, because they were being bused long distances to the high school, and the high schools were also kind of hostile. So that had more of an impact on East Palo Alto, but there were kids from our schools, our community, who also went to Woodside and San Carmel, I'm sorry. In terms of housing, outside of the downtown area, the west side was mainly single family dwellings. Belle Haven always had a few multifamily housing, and they were primarily around our perimeters. So Pierce Road, which faces 101, Del Norte, which runs down the side towards like the center, and then Hamilton and Willow, which are high density areas with larger multifamily dwellings. And so we've always had some in our area, and the general plans from 1952 to the present can demonstrate or show you how we have always had affordable housing and high density housing in Belle Haven.
So did you mention that you graduated from Ravenswood High School?
No, I didn't mention that.
Yeah.
I should mention that I attended Belle Haven Elementary, O'Connor, Green Oaks, and Ravenswood High School. My family moved here in 1955 when the redlining was going on. And so I did attend all of those schools.
And, we also forgot to mention that Suburban Park and Belle Haven were annexed at the same time in 1949. And by 1955, Belle Haven had the largest number of African Americans in San Mateo County. And by the late 50s, both East Palo Alto and Belle Haven particularly were eventually up to 85% African American. And this is documented from when you look at our old census. So it's logical our schools would have been segregated. Do you want to talk about it?
No, I'll let you talk about the
gender. Okay. So when we do this in person, we can kind of look at each other and know who's going to do what next. And we're always switching up. But at any rate, this is a working map before the new general plan map was adopted. This was in 2014. And you can see Belle Haven here. The green that you see, this green rectangle, is the now 777 Hamilton. It was already zoned for mixed use, but it was upzoned later so that we would to high density apartments. So that allowed the building of 777 Hamilton. This is on old RDA land, but interestingly enough, there were no units in there set aside for below market because none of them were below market. And the only reason that there are teachers living there is that was a subsidy from Facebook. Then this was supposed to be actually for people that worked for Facebook. If you go to the upper, it'll be your right or your left, you'll see some other areas that are outlined in green. That's where the Haven Avenue apartments were built. And then in red were the initial places that were going to have high density units, mixed use units in M2. And this is a way that the city could make up the funding that they lost for the RDA. One of the things that losing that fund did is it meant that salaries weren't going to be able to come from that fund anymore, and they were going to have to find a source to support the city staff. The region here, all along in here, this is before, well, Facebook had built their first building, and I forget the number. And then the area here had multiple buildings. Eventually, Facebook was able to buy them out. And so you have the second building, and then up here is going to be an apartment. The yellow areas are zoned for high density. So it's a possibility we could have more housing in the Belle Haven, in District 1, the Belle Haven neighborhood. The area, the brown area over here between Willow Road and University Avenue, that was annexed by Menlo Park in, can't remember the date, it was 83 or something. And at the time they did that, it was before East Palo Alto was incorporated, but they had a council, and that council that was through the county, but the council actually asked Menlo Park 1 not to do it, and later on, when they were working on becoming a city, wanted that property back. But you know, before they were annexed, they didn't have any power, you know, to save the property here. So it's, you know, Menlo Park, and we see here that this is where the Willow Village is going to go. So when you look at this map, keep in mind that this is in 2014, and then we ended up with a general plan in 2016 that allows Facebook, the Willow Village, and they are discussing that on the Planning Commission tonight. So think about how these things kind of fit in together. So when we think about how Belle Haven is the way that it is, and there's many of us, there's a lot of us that we love our little neighborhood because it has such great diversity. So we went from the African American community, which once fair housing was legal, then many of our families did buy outside of the neighborhood. I know my family wanted an Eichler, and we all knew about Eichlers, but this was an opportunity for them to get into it. So we now had the Spanish-speaking population, but the policies, the practices always kept our schools segregated. It also tells us about displacement, because with the disinvestment study that Juanita talked about, that was gathered information in 2017 to 2019 and was released in 2020, documented the displacement and the gentrification that was going on. And at that time, it was requested that the city of Menlo Park that has some kind of way of tracking who is being moved out. We already know we had a number of people that left the community because of the loan crisis, which affected us deeply. And then Facebook saying that they would pay their what is it? I think it was $10,000 for singles and $15,000 for families to buy homes in East Palo Alto and in Belle Haven. And of course, we let them know that was not the thing that we wanted them to do. And we'll look at what happened with COVID-19 and how it affected us, as well as the flooding. So here's the school districts. And as you could see, in 2010, Belle Haven was predominantly Hispanic. That was the color here, with the green little dots there that you cannot see. That was the African American population. And you can see, bingo, stops right at the freeway. When we look at this 2010 map, 2021 map, we see we still have the concentration of the Latino community as here, as well as in East Palo Alto, and then of course the non-Hispanic white. Here we are over in the area just across the freeway. That's where you start having your density. In population that affects the schools. The next thing to look at is the subprime loans and gentrification. Subprime loans, they had a heyday talking us into getting a loan that they knew no one could fulfill the obligation the way it was set up. And so the areas on this map, this is urban displacement project, show Belle Haven along with East Palo Alto and North Fair Oaks is kind of in the middle here, but this coloring means that at high risk of displacement and gentrification, whereas the orange areas, and the darker the orange, the less likely they are to be have issues around displacement or be displaced. The one that really hit me very hard, and that's because I have a background in healthcare, was moving forward to 2021 with COVID. 2020, we were trying to get data on that because we knew that we had a fairly high rate, but we weren't getting tested that was specifically for our community, and we didn't have data. North Fair Oaks, Belle Haven, and East Palo Alto did not have data that was about their particular area. Belle Haven was always counted in with Menlo Park, and Menlo Park had a good rate overall. But when we finally looked at Belle Haven in 2021, in January or February, Belle Haven had 51% of the COVID cases and 18% of the population. So high blue, lots of COVID. This area here in the middle, it was nursing homes, and the overall infection rate there was not near as high. It's twice as high as the rest of Menlo Park, but not near as high as what we see with Belle Haven. So you want to take the floods?
Sure. So flooding has always been a problem in Belle Haven. We were on the floodplain, but people didn't realize that, I think, at the time, where there had been landfill as opposed to actual ground. And so this map shows the flooding area, and as you can see, it takes up almost all of Belle Haven for most of the blocks to the left and to the right up to Willow Road. So only a small area that wasn't flooded at that time, though it is still part of the floodplain. So this is just to show the impact of flooding in our area. Here's another map. This is the 2022 FEMA flood map. And so again, in the red, you can see the outline of Belle Haven and East Palo Alto too, I think.
Yeah.
And so as you can see, again, most of the neighborhood is affected. Now, the light brown patches that you see in the middle are generally either a few homes or Facebook property that's been elevated above the floodplain. So in our neighborhood, we do have patches of either a home that was built and they elevated it to get it above the floodplain so they didn't have to pay flood insurance, or it's Facebook property. Everybody else in the floodplain has to pay flood insurance, and I know for me, I've been paying flood insurance for over 40 something years. So this is the current map.
Okay, so I am going to stop screen sharing, and we are going to, before we get into the general plan, time for questions.
So for some of the questions I see, we kind of answered, I guess one of them, we answered about, is this going to be recorded to the future? I mean, for other people, and we replied, say yes. The second one is there an incentive for this session? We replied and said, we're not offering a financial incentive tonight. And then the second last question we see in the chat is, have Belle Haven leaders had a voice in the development of Willow's village project?
Okay. Can I take that one?
Sure.
Yeah, the last one, and that is prior to 2018, Belle Haven did not have anybody on the city council that represented them since Billy Ray White, and that was in the 60s. African Americans that did run from our neighborhood never were able to get enough votes citywide. So at the time when the general plan was approved in 2016, and all of the development had already been decided because the developers drove the general plan, we had no representation. Now, fast forward to 2018, we now have district elections, and we do have representation on the city council. A challenge is if the project falls within the basic guidelines of the general plan, it's pretty hard to stop it, because that's why the general plan was actually done the way that they did do it. So, oh boy. Anyway, so I don't know. Did you want to add anything, Juanita?
I was just going to say, in the only voice I participated in with the Willow Village was they did ask a few of the people they identified as leaders to take a look at their plans. And so, and this was early on, even before some of the meetings and so forth they had around the requirements. And so they did share with us their ideas and plans. And then sometimes the developer would ask us about what I would call the amenities. And so the amenities discussion was mainly what they would talk about. So nothing significant about the development itself, but the things that they wanted to verify what might be useful to the community. So, and even with that, it was amenities has different notations or whatever. And so that could be almost anything. And so we didn't feel like we were really being included in a significant discussion around what was going on. We were just being pacified with amenities. Yeah.
So Tom, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion about the history. And one of the things I was wondering, I think you mentioned that the Belle Haven area was annexed into the city of Menlo Park in 1949. And I'm wondering, have you seen articles or know, how different parties were presenting that and what their motivations were, say, business leaders in different areas and residents in different areas? And then were there other options for the Belle Haven area at that time other than being annexed into Menlo Park?
At that time, like I said, Belle Haven had one set of issues, and Suburban Park was going to do whatever Belle Haven did. There was a group in the Belle Haven community, because they did have an active, I can't think of the name of it, but they had a very active homeowners association. They did have a business association because there were businesses over here pretty much in the same place as they are now. And so there wasn't a big discussion about why do we want to have this and why do we want to have it? And if I remember correctly, and I don't have the notes in front of me, it was Belle Haven neighborhood would actually benefit by being part of the city because of the services that they had to offer. So that was a part of it. I don't know what drove the Suburban Park, Lorelei, that area over there, Flood Triangle, because there wasn't any businesses there at that time. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it always helps to for me to understand a little bit of the context and what parties were trying to achieve. And, you know, I also think as I look at your presentation, it'll make a great timeline about all these different practices happening nationally and locally, and the different events along, just to see how they relate in time. Like, what was that period of busing that was happening, and how does that relate to the different things going on with the school facilities?
And Tom, from my perspective, the annexation of Belle Haven had more to do with the fact that the city of Menlo Park was trying to gain access to the bay. And if you look at Suburban Park and Belle Haven together, Marsh Road defines that the northern edge. And the thing with Belle Haven was the Dumbarton Bridge had just gone in around 1937 or something. I forget the exact dates, but and so Belle Haven was in between the city and the bay. And also growing up, Hiller Helicopter is in the area that used to be part of East Palo Alto. And Belle Haven had been a part of East Palo Alto. We were part of the unincorporated Ravenswood. And so Hiller Helicopter, they wanted to be annexed by Menlo Park. And so again, Belle Haven is sitting in the middle of access to the Dumbarton Bridge, access to the bay, and the area, the M2 area that we know now is part of that. So to me, it was like inevitable that Belle Haven was going to be annexed because we're sitting right in the middle of all of that.
Yeah, and I forgot that part. And you know, Juanita and I are working on a timeline, very specific timeline. We have less than 20 minutes left for the rest of our presentation. So shall we just move on here?
Yes, if we can bring Kate up and have him make the presentation on the housing element and general plan.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Pam and Juanita, for giving that vital history. And I feel like that really frames this next part of the conversation that we're going to have very well. And this is related to the general plan update process, which includes the housing element update, the safety element update, and the environmental justice element update. So you can go to the next slide there. So the overall goals, like I was saying, just produce a balanced community that's affordable and lives up to the demands of justice, are the overarching goals. And next, please. So again, SB 1000 was the law that requires cities to incorporate environmental justice into their general plan update process. And in doing so, the state really recognized that the history of discrimination, of redlining, of block busting, and of racialized zoning has really, continues to impact people that live in those communities, continues to impact families, and that specific intentional efforts need to be made in order to address that history of discrimination. Next slide. And I think we can go to the next slide real quickly and then come back to this one in just a moment. But I think to really frame this conversation, we need to talk a little bit about what environmental justice really is. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has a specific definition, which says that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But for my organization, Climate Resilient Communities, CRC, we like to take a more expansive definition of that. So to us, environmental justice is three things. It's distributional, it's procedural, and it's substantive. So taking those sort of like one at a time, environmental justice is about the distribution of the benefits and burdens associated with our system of production and who ends up bearing those burdens. So in the specific context of Menlo Park, right, there's been times in the history of Menlo Park and in Belle Haven when we've wanted to have like a factory, for example. There's a lot of industrial sites that are on the bayfront because they wanted access to the bay to move industrial goods in and out. But those industrial facilities create a lot of pollution, leave contamination after they move out. And when that happens, you know, you have to look at who's left dealing with those consequences, right? And what you find looking, you know, across communities, across the board, is that polluting activity gets located in places where the residents have the least resources, the least organization to oppose it, right? And so if we're thinking in the context of Menlo Park, where is the polluting activity going to be located? Is it going to be located in West Menlo? Is it going to be located in Suburban Park? Or is it going to be located in the former redlined community that has a history of discrimination and all of the associated economic consequences of that? And so what you see is this concentration of polluting activity in communities with the least amount of resources to address them. Right, so that's the distributional piece. But environmental justice is also procedural, right? So part of the reason those decisions got made were because communities of color, disadvantaged communities, people that had been pushed out of the process were not at the table, right? So part of environmental justice is ensuring that those voices are back at the table, are active in the conversation. And then finally, once we realize that some people are bearing the burdens of what we all benefit from more than others, and that those people have been left out of the process of deciding to do that, then it calls on all of us to come together and address that injustice, right? So the last plank is that environmental justice has to be substantive. It has to actually amount to real changes for the people who are facing the history of discrimination and the direct toxic environmental consequences that come with it. So it's those 3 planks. And if we go back to the last slide real quickly, there's sort of, 7 like broad themes that we think about when we're addressing environmental justice, but some of the main ones are ensuring safe and sanitary homes, reducing pollution exposure, whether that's from traffic or from industrial activities, increasing civic engagement so that those people who have been excluded from the process are now included, enhance the use and creation of public facilities, and incentivize people to be physically active, and improve access to healthy foods. So those are some of the approaches to alleviating those harms. And one more. There you go. So again, this is something that we touched on in a little bit in the history, but that this history of redlining discrimination has real measurable consequences related to the environment. So you see in East Palo Alto, in Belle Haven, communities that have been historically marginalized and discriminated against have really worse environmental outcomes than places that are, a street away, right? If you look at that stark difference there between Suburban Park and Belle Haven, you can see that literally just the freeway, right, is all that separates a very clean environment from one that needs a lot more work. And so you can go to the next slide. And these next few slides really just sort of, again, demonstrate that distributional component. So you can look at the next one. Same thing, the risk of lead from housing. I would say keep going. Here are some other figures that show like how things are specific in Belle Haven. So again, education because of that history, linguistic isolation, housing burden, people aren't able to afford housing, and then a lot of things that are going to be connected to environmental indicators. So low birth weight and poverty are both inherently connected to your environment. But also asthma is, I think, not really fully captured in this data that's being shown here, because people without a lot of economic resources don't go to the hospital when they're confronted with an asthma attack. And that's sort of what this data around asthma relies on, is hospital admissions for that condition from a given address, right? So some of these indicators aren't exactly expressed perfectly because of, again, that same history manifesting itself in the data that we're then looking to evaluate the consequences. You can look at the next one. And I think this one really, makes clear that the distribution of environmental burdens in Menlo Park is almost entirely concentrated in the Belle Haven neighborhood. Air quality, hazardous waste, cleanup sites, lead risk, groundwater contamination. All of these things, again, are a consequence of that history of racialized zoning, of discrimination. So then that's the environmental justice element, right? But there's also a safety component that comes with the general plan update process. And that looks at sort of more immediate acute shocks. So wildfires, flooding and sea level rise, earthquakes, emergency response, those sort of things. You can look at the next one. So when CRC was brought in with the city of Menlo Park to help coordinate and do community outreach for the environmental justice element, we wanted to make sure that the process was really community driven from the very jump and driven by Belle Haven residents. So that started by forming a climate change community team, which consists of other nonprofit leaders in Belle Haven residents, people in the faith community, and just kind of a large group that gives you a great cross section of a lot of the different work that's being done. So we started with building that team, and the team helped advise us on how they think that their neighbors would like to be reached out to, what we could do to help bring those people who have been excluded from the conversation to the table, and how we can make that process as seamless as possible and lower as many barriers to participation as we could. So I think you can go to the next slide. That included really two big planks. We did a series of focus groups, and we did a survey. So we did 3 focus groups. One was put on by Belle Haven Community Development Fund, our lovely host tonight. One was also coordinated and done entirely in Spanish by our partners El Comité, who work a lot in East Palo but a lot in Belle Haven as well. And then we had one that was conducted and coordinated entirely by community leaders and residents. So we had 3 community leaders who are very well connected to different communities within Belle Haven. And I think the results speak for themselves. We had more than 120 attendees attend a multiple hour focus group session where they provided feedback on their environment and the things that they were concerned about and the ways they wanted to see it addressed too. And then to go with that, we also conducted a survey. So you can look at the next slide. And again, we worked with that climate change community team that we brought together early on in the process to help design what questions they thought would be interesting to people in Belle Haven, what they thought would be applicable. And again, we collaborated with the team to actually hit the ground, go door to door, and get people to fill out the surveys. All told, we had a little more than 420 responses to the survey, and more than 300 of those came from Belle Haven and were the direct result of the team and CRC working together to knock doors and get people's input. So the results of all that work still coming soon. So stay tuned for that. But the city is ultimately going to release a draft of the environmental justice and safety element that will be recirculated for public comment. We're going to go back to the community, get more input on what the city has done with the information that residents provided through the focus groups and through the survey, And if residents aren't happy with what they see in that report, I think we're going to mobilize people and make sure that those concerns are adequately and appropriately addressed. So I think that's what's next for the environmental justice and safety element. All right, we can stop my section there so that we have just a couple minutes here before we wrap to talk about questions.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
All right. So thank you, Cade and Pam and Juanita for this really informative presentation. The main question I'm sitting with is, as someone who doesn't live in Belle Haven, but lives in Menlo Park, what can I do to support the Belle Haven community as future decisions are being made? Yeah.
I think that's a good question. I would turn it over to our Belle Haven residents to respond. Pam, do you have anything you wanted to say about how would you answer that question?
I would like for Juanita to start, and I also, if there's any, I see a Belle Haven resident on this chat, if they would like to also make a comment. So, Juanita.
Forgot I was muted. Okay. One of the main things is support with the city, because we have challenges in terms of when people think to include Belle Haven in discussions or decision making and all of that. And so one of the ways would be like having other people who are in those meetings say, where is Belle Haven? You know, has anyone reached out to Belle Haven? And also encouraging them to do more than just do it digitally or electronically, because our community is not does not use technology to that level. And so the tendency is to use that technology because it's quick and fast, but quick and fast doesn't work for a community that doesn't use it. The other thing for me is always about data. One of the problems Belle Haven has had is that Pam and I have been researching a lot of stuff, and there's just not enough data. And so it's like finding out that the monitors that they were using to determine pollution was not even in Belle Haven. You know, it's like, we don't know where things are. We don't know what the city's doing. We don't, you know, we're not in the room. As an affirmative action person from the days, we're not on the good old boys network. So we don't have access to things. And that in and of itself is another discriminatory practice. So if you're not inviting people into the room and they can't have access to the data or, you know, things like that. For me, those are two things I would say. Yeah.
Nina, did you want to add anything?
The one thing I can say is amplify us, because even though we have representation on city council, if it sounds like Belle Haven people are the only ones speaking up for Belle Haven, then everybody else can just say, oh, that's them over there again. Too bad they're on city council now. They need to hear it from the rest of Menlo Park.
Thank you. Chantel?
There's another question in the chat. It says, are the slides of 29 to 31 maps of impact coming from the California Environment Screen tool? And then there's a double question saying, does that use the resolution to the census tract level or to a different level?
Yeah, so I can take that. So the information that was in the little boxes is data that the city of Menlo Park collected, but I think it's largely based on Cal Enviroscreen data too. And then the maps that show the color variants are Cal Enviroscreen maps. And those do use census tract level data as their lowest level of granularity, which is actually really problematic for Belle Haven and for a lot of communities in San Mateo County in particular, because that census tract is a large tract of area, and a lot of the census tract that includes Belle Haven includes Suburban Park. So looking only at census tract data almost isn't enough to actually get the granularity you need to actually see the true environmental consequences in Belle Haven. And that's also the case when there's communities like North Fair Oaks that are really near Atherton, and again, share a census tract with Atherton. So you have a community that's 80% North Fair Oaks, but then 20% of it are Atherton homes, and you get a completely just nonsense picture of what's happening there based on that aggregation here in the data.
Oh, I have another question. This is my question. So one of the questions I have is, what can make this survey be more exciting for youth or other people?
Good question.
That's a really good question.
That's really good.
I don't know, Chantal, you can tell me if I still qualify as a youth or not, but I think that there's a lot that can be done. And I think CRC's main strategy and sort of focus is like, when people come and ask us to do or how to do community engagement work, I think my answer is always, you can do community engagement well and meaningfully, or you can do it cheaply. And that if you want people to actually have input in the process, engage in the process, then you can't just use social media. You can't just use the cheapest options, because again, that ensures that you're only getting the most tied in, the most connected residents in the room for those conversations. And that's the exact system that has created the situation that we have today. So it takes an intentional effort outside of the typical constraint, which is like, just how many people can we reach for this dollar, to specifically go, like Marlon was with us when we were out there, and we were, knocking a lot of doors, going door to door to solicit input from people. Because if you just rely on sending out a Facebook message or whatever, it's not going to get to the people who most need to be part of the conversation. So I think that is how you start, and then how you make it fun for youth to be involved. I think incentives are a great way to get people interested. I think that having youth input in focus groups and stuff like that is also a lot more engaging than just like having a young person fill out a survey. So having folks of all stripes in those conversations from the jump is definitely the best way to go about it, and ensure you're hearing from everyone. I see we're getting close to time here, but if anyone has any other questions, I can put my email here in the chat too, so you can reach out to me if you're interested in hearing more or have anything else you want to share.
I would like to add that the presentation that Juanita and I did is really truncated. And we are working on presenting a lot more information and posting it. When we do, that will be made public.
Tom got in one more question there towards the end. I'll address it real quickly, which is just how might we improve the resolution of the data to get around some of those aggregation errors that put Belle Haven in with the rest of Menlo Park, or don't quite give you the granularity that you need to make some really strong statements. I think one is sort of circumventing that process of collecting data altogether. So I think, again, what we did with the survey and the climate change community team in Belle Haven was a good way to get data that is ground truth, that is granular at the household level, and doesn't make any of those aggregation mistakes, right? So there's other downsides that you can say with the way that we collected data, but one thing you can't say is that we didn't get a strong representative sample of Belle Haven and of what people in Belle Haven are interested in. We asked a lot of questions that were specific to, that applied to the whole household. So we had 300 Belle Haven households represented in that data, which is more than 1,500 residents at that point on average. So that's like a really robust sample. And again, it's not cheap, right? But that can't be the way, that can't be your only operating interest when you're trying to do this work. It can't just be the cheapest solution. It has to be the solution that produces the best outcome, and it's going to take attention and it's going to take time. So.
Well, thank you all so much, Cade, Pam, and Juanita, for these really information-packed presentations about the history and the evolving development, what's going on in the Belle Haven area. It's been enlightening and disturbing. And so it's an important thing for the community to look at and confront and look for ways to work together to improve these situations. I think we should be looking at additional topics we can explore together as this series of community collaborative conversations about the basic issues facing us and our future as this evolves. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.